So Oklahoma celebrated its entry into the SEC by making its fans run a race. Yeah, there was a 5K that started at 11:30 p.m. Central Time on June 30th. That, if you're straggling in that race, if you're running a little slow, by the time you crossed the finish line, Oklahoma was in the SEC. Our friends Eddie Radosevich and George Stoia not running at midnight.
No.
A little disappointed in you guys, but hey, I understand you got a job to do.
We're not big health guys over here. Well, I mean, we're somewhat healthy, but we enjoy.
You
ourselves.
are healthy. There is nothing that I would have done less than run a 5K on a Sunday night. I don't think it would have mattered what day it was, Andy.
Yeah.
But we had to opt out of that. I will support anybody that wants to be a part of it, though.
Exactly. If you're that much of a health nut that you feel like running in the middle of the night to celebrate a conference move, go for it. But let's talk about the move itself, because this is something that Oklahoma fans have clearly been very excited about. But I remember a time when it felt like the administration in Oklahoma was not excited about the idea of the SEC, because the SEC wanted Oklahoma, wanted Texas all along. I think, going back 30 years, if Oklahoma and Texas had said, hey, we'd like to join the SEC, they would have been welcomed with open arms. But what was it as they approached, the middle of 2021 that finally put them over the edge, that said to Oklahoma, okay, this is a move that has to happen?
Well, Andy, I would start with, like you mentioned, there was a point in time that the university and the administration did not want to make a move to a conference like the SEC. And that goes back to President David Boren, who was in charge, who really pushed for Oklahoma and Texas to maybe move to the Pac-12 or the Big Ten for academic reasons. Obviously, there's been a change in leadership. President Joe Harris is somebody that I think obviously sees the benefits of the athletics department. And obviously, Joe Castiglione has been in charge now for over 25 years. And I think that he's also seen the change in college athletics, whether it's NIL, the transfer portal, the eventual paying of players in terms of employee status. I think they saw that. They see the future of college football, especially, and the way that it's trending towards maybe being a super league at some point. And they said, we have to get in now. And I think also the way the Big 12 was trending, that they knew that the Big 12 was a league that was maybe vulnerable and not as stable, while the SEC and the Big 10 are obviously the most stable leagues in college football and have been for the last decade. I think it made the most sense for Oklahoma in terms of money and where the program is at.
All-time worst take, hand up. I thought OU and the Pac-12 would have been a spectacular marriage, and to come to find out like 5 years later after that, or I guess more like a decade now, that would have been a awful decision.
Yeah,
I would have enjoyed some of the golf courses in Scottsdale, but outside of that,
listen, the road trips would have been spectacular to LA, to Phoenix, to Eugene. Like, it would have been awesome, to Seattle. But yeah, it was not managed particularly well. But yes, let's go back in time, because you mentioned David Boren, the former president of Oklahoma, Bill Powers, the former president of Texas. They were the ones that drove the train on a lot of this stuff. And they were in league before, talking to Larry Scott with the then Pac-10 about multiple schools from the Big 12, 6 of them, in fact, going to join and become the Pac-16. And it was Texas that kind of scuttled that, because they wanted to form the Longhorn Network. And so Oklahoma just they were ready to go. Like, Larry Scott had been on their campus in Norman, and then all of a sudden it was over.
Yeah, I mean, David Boren, I remember David Boren really wanted that to happen.
It's almost kind of a godsend that it didn't happen. I mean, Who knows where they would be right now as not just a school, but athletic department. Had they done that, that would have been very detrimental to the progress that's been made.
Yeah, and it would have also just changed college football landscape. Like, I would think that the Pac-12, I guess would have been Pac-16, would probably still be a conference.
Sure.
Because if you have
the Big 12 would have been gone at that point.
Exactly, because it was the same time period that Texas A&M and Nebraska had made the move to the Big Ten. So, or I guess Texas A&M, Missouri going to the SEC.
Sure. Well, no. So Texas A&M was going to the Pac-16.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and Missouri wanted to go to the Big Ten, and couldn't quite get the traction. Nebraska was leaving. Colorado was leaving no matter what. They were going to go to the Pac-16. Oklahoma State was going along. That's the thing. Bedlam would still exist.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable the way that everything would have turned out. I mean, everybody would have been, I guess, taken care of. But at the end of the day, I think you ask anybody around here, particularly going into next week, I think people like the way that this worked out. I think it's been very comfortable.
And I think that Oklahoma, and we've said this to Andy, like Eddie and I, kind of getting to know some of the people in the SEC. I was down in Destin for spring meetings, and we went to Nashville last year for media days. It just feels like OU's fan base, the culture, the program, whether it's athletic directors, coaches, they fit in pretty well with the culture, I think, of the SEC. And I don't know if that's always been the same. And there will be an adjustment period. And like Eddie said, I think fans are excited. I think there's also a bit of nervousness, especially when it comes to
cautious optimism.
Yeah, competing and again,
until you look at the schedule, and
right.
It's like, oh boy.
But I do think long term, when you look at this, they fit very well in the fabric of the conference, and I think people, for the most part, are super excited about it. And Greg Sankey's talked about it. This is really, in terms of OU and Texas, I think a perfect fit.
I go back to that home and home with Tennessee a few years ago. And I think that's probably where, if you were an Oklahoma person, you looked at that and go, wow, this would be a nice fit, because it felt like, obviously the programs in the SEC respect what Oklahoma's been over the decades. And for those of us, inside baseball, for those of us who cover all this stuff, like, we know how much all the ADs in the SEC love Joe Castiglione. Like, he's one of the most respected guys in the business. So it's one of those things where if he would like to be in their club, they would like to have him in their club.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just talking with the administration around here in Norman, I think that there is a relative appreciation for everybody else. I think that, like, Oklahoma and Alabama, Oklahoma and Georgia, their athletic departments, from my understanding, they talk quite a bit in terms of kind of putting themselves through the same lens. And I think
site visits, best practices. How do you do this? How do you do this? That sort of thing. They've been doing that for years.
And I think, to a certain extent, even at the university level, with Joe Harris, the president of the University of Oklahoma, I think that he has found himself kind of acclimating himself to the other presidents and everybody else, whether it be at some of these meetings that you were at in Destin or wherever. It feels very comfortable. And that's why, like, on Monday, as big as the celebration is going to be in Norman, it kind of feels like this move has already been made for the longest of time.
Yeah, because they've been sitting in a lot of these meetings. And again, like, going down to Destin, like, it was made aware to me that Joe Harris, and for those who don't know Joe Harris, he loves to talk. He loves being in front of a mic. He's kind of a comedian a bit. He was a big voice in a lot of those meetings in Destin. He spoke up a lot, talked a lot about changes in his opinion on certain things. So I think that they're fitting really well. You mentioned Joe Castiglione. Obviously, he's somebody that's very well respected, not only in the SEC, but all of college athletics. And for him, I think that he's the perfect guy to obviously lead Oklahoma into this. And there's been a lot of talk about, when is Joe C going to retire? He's been doing this for so long. I think he's definitely going to see this thing through for several years, and wants to, make sure that Oklahoma is in the right spot before he steps away.
The man has a whole conference full of new breakfast spots. Also, for those who don't know, Joe Castiglione, huge fan of breakfast, huge fan of diners. When they made this move, I texted him a list town by town of the places he needs to eat in the SEC. He's slowly working his way down the list. So this part is going to be fun. And so you mentioned a little nervousness among the Oklahoma fan base as they look at the schedule, as they look at what their new conference rivals are going to look like. How do you think they fit in football wise?
I'll let you take this, Eddie.
I think from like a off-field perspective, I think that Oklahoma fans feel like they fit in just about as well as anybody, and probably even more so than I don't want to cherry pick some teams, but I think that they feel like the fervor and the passion, and obviously the just log on to Twitter if you can get on. I'm currently not able to log on, but if you can get past that, like the zaniness of the fan base, I think it matches up with anybody. Certainly, year 2 was better than year 1 under Brent Venables. I think that they've taken steps into what they feel like is getting closer and closer to be able to compete with some of the quote unquote big dogs of the SEC. But they've got a ways to go. I think obviously it starts on the offensive line. It starts on the defensive line. It's something that we've talked to you about, Andy, just in terms of what Oklahoma is from an offensive line standpoint going into their first season in the SEC. But getting a guy like a Dominic Williams from TCU, I think that they feel like they're starting to make those strides. Obviously, the 2024 recruiting class that they brought in with the defensive line is going to be a positive. It's going to probably take a couple years to really get a feel for where that thing is at with the David Stones and Jaden Jacksons of the world. But I think they feel like they're taking the right steps. And that's why you kind of look at year number 3 and the year number 1 in the SEC for Oklahoma. If you were able to get to 8, 9, even 10 wins, and all of a sudden you look up and you're getting into a college football playoff, I think it would be a spectacular season. So, yeah, I mean, I think that Oklahoma football, obviously the brand just in and of itself is something that, I at least from the Norman perspective, I think it should heighten, what the SEC is. But at the same time, they're going to have their work cut out for them going into this first season, especially with that schedule.
Andy, and I've told you this, the long term, it's about the long term expectations for the program, because I understand OU fans want to win a lot next year, and if they win 9 games, that's a great year for them when you look at that schedule. And I think that you look at the way that they're recruiting, this thing it's going to take some time to be built, because they have recruited at a high level, but now you're starting to see some of those guys get in. I think that you start looking at the 2025 season, 2026, we'll see what that conference schedule looks like. I just think it's going to be tough to, next year, if OU goes 8-4, there'll be people out there saying, well, this is the demise of Brent Venables and the program's heading in the wrong direction. I would view it as that's almost a step in the right direction next year if you get 8 or 9 wins because of how tough the schedule is. So I think no one is expecting OU to win a national championship next year.
It's also one of those things that and I think that just college football fans as a whole are going to have to learn, especially as we get into this 12-team playoff and some of the bigger conferences. Winning 11 or 12 games every single season, year out, and obviously the expectations that Oklahoma fans have for the program, they're going to have to change a little bit. It's not saying that they shouldn't have the expectation to play for an SEC championship or get into a playoff or go, compete for the national championship. But I think the days of these undefeated teams just all over the country, and especially in the SEC or some of these Power 4 conferences, that's over to a certain extent. It's just going to be too competitive.
Yeah. So I want to go back to when they made the move, because Lincoln Riley was the head coach at the time, and he said all the right things about needing to do the transition. And one thing that Oklahoma fans consistently said after Lincoln Riley left, and people said it was sour grapes, is, he was not necessarily the right person to lead Oklahoma into the SEC. I think history has vindicated the Oklahoma fans on that statement. I think if you look at how he's worked at USC, that would not have helped. Doing what he's done at USC would not have helped Oklahoma going into the SEC. Doesn't really help USC going into the Big Ten. Brent Venables, on the other hand, comes from Clemson, which was not in the SEC, but always had to deal with Alabama at some point. Or the goal was to get to playing Alabama, or to play the version of Alabama now, which is probably Georgia. And they felt like they had to have the roster to do that. And they recruited a roster that could do that ended up beating Alabama twice in national title games. That's what I find very interesting, is while in the moment that seemed like such a devastating move when Lincoln Riley left, I think it probably set them up better when they hired Brent Venables, because I think the roster will be in a better place now and going forward to compete in the SEC.
I think that's certainly the case.
It might
Andy.
be the best thing that ever happened to Oklahoma football. Revisionist history, obviously.
We'll see with Brent, because I think there's still some skepticism there. I certainly think that you love the recruiting side of it, the leaps they've made on defense, and everybody expects them to have a very good defense this year. We'll see if he can still improve in terms of being kind of a CEO, head coach, and game management and all that comes with that. And obviously he made 2 big hires this offseason. We'll see how those pan out with Seth Luttrell as the offensive coordinator, Zach Alley coming in as a co-defensive coordinator and kind of taking the reins. But in terms of where this was heading under Lincoln Riley, there was a lot of holes that I think were covered up in terms of roster management or obviously the defensive side of football by great quarterback play, right? Because they had all these great quarterbacks. Caleb Williams, obviously the last one at Oklahoma that you look back at that, 2021 season, that was such a kind of a roller coaster of a year where they're playing a bunch of close games. They lost games that they shouldn't have. And really the only reason they won as many games as they did is because Caleb Williams was so special and that offense was so special. And you're seeing that kind of at USC now where it kind of covered some things up for them in terms of whether it was recruiting or the defense being a liability. I think as a program and as a team, you're seeing top to bottom, it's just a better, I would say, culture, one, and also two, roster in terms of how many elite guys they have on both sides of the football. So I think in that sense, definitely we'll see though, like I said, if Brent can be, this is a big year for him. And like I said, 8 wins would be good. 9 wins would be great. 10 wins would be sensational. So we'll see. But I think that, the verdict is still out on Brent.
Sure.
But I do think they're in a better spot than they were under Lincoln.
The biggest thing for Oklahoma going into this year, and when you look at the schedule and you realize how many close games you're going to be playing, the one-score games has not been kind to Oklahoma over the first 2 seasons under Brent Venables.
3-7.
They're going to have to be able to find ways to change that because I think you expect, you just kind of know going into this conference, into this schedule particularly, you're going to be in tight ball games late in the third and fourth quarter. And if you're leaning on a freshman quarterback in Jackson Arnold, you're going to have to find ways to win some of these one-score games.
Yeah, I think a lot of this discussion of Oklahoma and the SEC, we're centering it on this year. And this year, like you guys and I've talked about the offensive line quite a bit. Like if they had last year's offensive line going into this season, we're not having that discussion. I think this just happened to fall on the wrong year for the offensive line moving to the SEC. But I'm not worried about Oklahoma going forward. And you guys mentioned that, maybe the jury's not quite in on Venables yet because it's Oklahoma and the standard is very high. But I do think the administration now understands, and I think Venables has a hand to play in that, exactly what the roster needs to look like, what the infrastructure needs to look like. And whether he's the guy or not, he has to prove on the field. But I think they're aware now of what they need.
100%. And I think that you've seen them make some of those steps. Obviously, it was something that we've talked about. It feels like every time that we go out to a practice and we're allowed to come in for a viewing period, you come back and you go, man, that they look different physically. And I think that like Des Malone, somebody that they were able to bring in from San Diego State in the transfer portal. You think of, we talked about Dominic Williams. There are multiple guys. And obviously the way that they've started to recruit on the defensive side of the football is drastically different from what they were doing under Lincoln Riley. So they've been able to shore up that roster. I think it's starting to look a little bit more like a quote unquote, what you would expect from an SEC football team. But they still got a ways to go. And I think that, I don't think that there's anybody out there that is illusioned that all of a sudden they're going to go and knock around Georgia or go knock around Alabama, which is going to be interesting when they come to Norman. But at the same time, I think that they have taken those steps. And, certainly the way that this athletic department has been, run under Joe Castiglione, I feel like they've been an SEC style type athletic department for the longest of time.
Yeah, and they have, and that's the part I think, a lot of the SEC fan bases maybe don't understand about Oklahoma because they're looking at Texas, which is really good right now, but has been historically very inconsistent. There's only one program in college football that's been more consistent than Oklahoma, and that's Ohio State.
Yeah. And I think this also goes back to when they made the hire for Brent, like Joe Castiglione has talked about it. They wanted somebody that could come in and fit the SEC mold. And I think that Brent does that in terms of the way that he's recruiting. And also you look at the teams that have been successful in the SEC, Alabama, Georgia, LSU, a few years ago, they all had elite defenses. And obviously they have great quarterback play. And Oklahoma is still continuing to build that in terms of recruiting and the belief in Jackson Arnold. So I do think, Andy, that, and you've said it, Andy, if Brent isn't the guy, Oklahoma will just do what they've done for the last, 80 years, is they'll just go hire the next guy. I mean, other than a period in the 90s, Oklahoma has always been successful. That doesn't mean that they're going to go win a national title in the next, few years. I think it's going to be really tough for anybody to win a national title or the SEC championship. But I think that Oklahoma has the track record of being a blue blood in this sport, and they'll figure it out at some point.
So we know Texas will be a huge rival going forward. Obviously, they've always been huge rivals, even when they weren't in the same conference. But unlike Texas, which gets to reunite with Texas A&M, gets to reunite with Arkansas from the old Southwest Conference days, two just hated rivals.
Oh, yeah.
Not the same thing for Oklahoma. Now, Missouri was in the Big Eight with Oklahoma, but who do you think among the schools in the SEC, who becomes a kind of secondary rival for Oklahoma? Could it be A&M, who they were with in the Big 12? Could it be Arkansas, who they're a border state, but they've never really played very much?
It's so weird too, because they haven't played a whole lot. Like the OU Arkansas thing, at least in my lifetime, has never really been that big of a deal. They certainly haven't played on the football field outside of the Cotton Bowl in like 2001, 2002.
Yeah, I think.
So it is kind of weird. And Missouri, like I know George has tried to start a Missouri rivalry.
Hey, the fans have tried to start a Missouri rivalry online, and they just deny it.
I think Eli Drinkwitz is trying to, because like Missouri being good helps that. But the problem, the old Big Eight history is Missouri was never good.
And you add in all of the stuff that happened with Caden Green here about 6-7 months ago.
Oh, yeah.
Moved up to Columbia. They've been locked in different recruiting battles here over the last couple years. It would be fun. I just don't think that, like, especially for anybody of our age or likeness, it doesn't seem like OU Missouri has ever been a thing. Maybe it was. I know, like back in the Norm Stewart days, him and Billy Tubbs would get into it in the basketball realm of things. But like the football side of it, it really has never been that much of a rivalry.
You had those couple years with Chase Daniel,
sure,
and they played in the Big 12 title game, and those sorts of things. But yeah,
I mean, a couple of the coaches like Curtis Lofton took a couple shots at Missouri, the new general manager for Oklahoma, but that was more so because they were playing in those games.
And I do think the SEC, it'll be interesting to see how they do the scheduling going forward, because if they go to the pod system where you have the three teams that you play every single year, I would think Missouri will probably be in that group for Oklahoma. Obviously, Texas would be. I don't know who that third team would be. Maybe Florida was a school that's been mentioned. Arkansas. I could see something between LSU and OU, just because
Baton Rouge every other year, the week of like Thanksgiving,
would be awesome.
Count me in. That sounds amazing to be able to go down there and eat every week or every other year.
And you've been to the basketball games between OU and Arkansas. It seems like but there's no like hatred there. So I don't
that
really
was more
know.
Like
Andy.
Everybody just yelled at Eric Musselman because he's a little squirrely, whatever.
I'm excited about this schedule because it feels like there's a subplot to almost every game, or it's somewhere that Oklahoma's going that's new. Like they're going to Auburn, they're going to Ole Miss, they go back to Missouri, they go to LSU, but like Tennessee comes. That's Josh Heupel coming back to Oklahoma. South Carolina, Shane Beamer was on the Lincoln Riley staffs and was working for Oklahoma when he got hired at South Carolina. So there's a lot of subplots to all of these games. Oh, by the way, they also play Alabama.
Yeah. It's incredible. And I think that, like, George, we were talking about it up here at the office one day. George ranked the SEC conference opponents 1 through 8. Outside of like 1, 2, you could probably make an argument for 8 being 3 and 3 being 8. I mean, I think that like they all are fascinating. And like you said, Andy, I think every game does have like a sub storyline. Even the Auburn game the week after Oklahoma opens the SEC play, I find that to be one of the more fascinating games, just
100%.
for the fact that Jackson Arnold's going to be making his first career true road start at Auburn. Like that's something that has been overlooked a little bit in terms of the whole grand scheme of Oklahoma moving into the SEC. So, and that's coming off the week, as you said, with Josh Heupel. And I think that, like, even though that bridge had kind of been burned, I think that there's some like connections back, or they're trying to mend those fences or the bridge. It's going to be cool to have Josh back in town, I think.
Yeah, and I think they'll do some sort of video or something to commemorate him. At least that's what I've heard, and we'll see how Josh. I mean, Josh has been, I think, really good talking to the media. Recently, I know in Destin, and then last year at Media Days, he got asked kind of about his return to Norman, and he obviously said he's looking forward to it. So I think that'll be cool. But you look at those games, I think we're going to kind of know what Oklahoma is in really the first couple games in the SEC. You look at their non-conference schedule; it's not particularly tough. But then all of a sudden, you get Tennessee at home and Auburn on the road. I think a lot of fans look at it and say, well, if they can start 5-0 and a lot of people expect them to, they've got a really good shot at maybe winning 9 games this year. So if they drop one of those games or drop a couple of them, and all of a sudden you're going to Dallas against Texas, who I think Texas is their toughest opponent this coming season, just because they get Alabama at home. I think that if you're sitting at 5-0 going into that Texas game, you feel pretty good. If you're going 4-1 or 3-2, you're looking at maybe a really long season.
They're 3-2.
Yeah, I did a column for years called Pivot Point Games, like where your season could turn. Like if I had to do it for Oklahoma and for Auburn this season, it would be the Oklahoma-Auburn game, because both of those teams, if they play as expected, should be 4-0 going into that game. Like the Auburn fan base obviously is going to want to welcome Oklahoma to the SEC with a true road environment. But both of those teams have huge rivalry games the next week where, their next game where Oklahoma plays Texas, Auburn plays at Georgia. And like, if Auburn doesn't beat Oklahoma, then they're going to have a loss going into a stretch of at Georgia, at Missouri, at Kentucky, which one loss could turn into 4 real quick if you're not careful. So for both of those teams, like that's a must-win game.
Yeah, it's huge, Andy. And I think it's just, we don't really know what to make of Auburn, I think, because, he's second year under Hugh Freeze and, the quarterback situation there. And I think they're going to be pretty good defensively and all of that. So that's a huge one. And then you look on the back half, let's say they get through those first 5 games, maybe they lose to Texas, whatever, they're let's say they're 6-1 heading to Ole Miss. That stretch right there is the one interesting one to me. At Ole Miss, obviously you get Maine at home. That's kind of that throwaway game in the back half of the season.
Sounds like you're sleeping on.
You're
sleeping on them.
I'm sleeping on them. But then at Missouri,
they hung with Mississippi State, or maybe they beat Mississippi State that one year. I think they beat Mississippi State in 2004.
Oh boy.
But we don't even want to put that bad juju out there. That it already is a little scary.
Yeah.
The back end.
At Ole Miss and at Missouri, those 2 games are the ones that I think could be big swing games for Oklahoma in terms of winning 8 or 9 or 10 games, because I know there's a lot of people high on Ole Miss with all the guys they got in the transfer portal and Jackson Dart back and all of that. Same with Missouri. They did really well in the portal. Those are the 2 teams that I look at and say, okay, those are going to be really close games. And if Oklahoma can, win one of those 2 games or both of those games, all of a sudden I think you are talking about Oklahoma potentially being a playoff team at 9-3 or 10-2.
Oh yeah. And look, if you're a 10-2 SEC team, you're going to the playoff, and the 9-3 is going to be a question. And like Oklahoma, it has a hard enough schedule that 9-3 may work for them. There's certain programs in the SEC that don't have that hard of a schedule, but there's a couple, their schedule is so hard that 9-3 might do the trick. So let's talk about Texas, because that's, with Texas, the conversation is a lot about Texas A&M and that piece of it. But a lot of this has happened because of Oklahoma and Texas's willingness to work together. How did that come to be?
Well, I think it has to go back to the relationship between Chris Del Conte and Joe Castiglione. Yeah. I mean, those are 2 guys that are very tight. And like I said, in Destin, those 2 were attached at the hip for a lot of those meetings. And I think that they've been pretty hand in hand in working together on making this move. And I think that goes back to, obviously Joe C's days at Missouri. Chris Del Conte was at Rice, when Joe C was at OU. So I think they worked together. And then obviously Del Conte at TCU. I think that's when they really became good friends, when TCU obviously came over to the Big 12. So I think that was a huge part of it. Obviously the 2 presidents, I think, working together. But I think when you look at this move, Andy, it's the 2 athletic directors seeing eye to eye and knowing, Joe C and Chris Del Conte both said this: when OU is good, it helps Texas. Yeah. When Texas is good, it helps OU. And maybe it hurts in recruiting every once in a while because you're going head to head on things, but it raises the bar. It's kind of like Michigan and Ohio State. I think that you look at the way that Michigan winning the national title this last year, I think that's kind of upped Ohio State's urgency, right? In the way that Michigan's been successful. I think that you're seeing that now with Oklahoma and Texas. And I know Texas had went through that spurt of not being as good, but that spurred them on to, obviously make the hires that they have and do the changes that they have. So I think that, again, when one is good, the other one, it typically raises their level.
I think that there's a certain level of respect too
Yes,
between
there is.
the two administrations. I certainly don't think you would ever be able to get the two fan bases to agree on that online, but I do think that there is a respect level between the two administrations, whether it be CDC and Joe Castiglione or all the way down, maybe even Brent Venables and Steve Sarkisian.
Yeah, I know that they talk quite often. And
probably more often than fans would want to admit or even know about.
And the same with like the collectives and NIL.
Sure.
I know that a lot of these programs, and it's not just OU and Texas. I know OU's talking to people at Ohio State and Alabama. OU just announced, their new collective all under one roof, one Oklahoma. I know that they kind of patterned that after some of the things that they've seen at Texas, as well as Alabama. And so they're in constant communication, kind of working together. And especially in today's new era of college football, I think a lot of these coaches talk to each other about the transfer portal and the changes in NIL and all those things. So like Eddie said, I don't know if the fans realize how much they enjoy talking to each other, but they definitely do.
Yeah, there's definitely a respect factor. And I will say, even though the Oklahoma fans and Texas fans don't always get along online, they get along better than Texas and Texas A&M fans. So they got that going for them.
Lately,
especially with the happenings out of the baseball side of things over the last
exactly. And boys, it's been wonderful talking about this. We will actually be talking to Joe Cook from Inside Texas about Texas's road to the SEC, and of course, we will be mentioning what happened in baseball last week, where Texas just poured gasoline on that rekindled rivalry. Guys, I cannot wait to see you at SEC Media Days. It's going to be a fun one.
It's going to be awesome. Can't wait.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.